In the book Night of the Assassins, author Howard Blum tells a story of Hitler's 1943 effort to assassinate three world leaders: FDR, Josef Stalin, and Winston Churchill. In the middle of World War II, these men were planning to meet secretly in Tehran. The Nazis wanted to kill them. Connecticut-based writer Howard Blum says his initial idea was to tell the tale of Operation Long Jump. In his note in the back on sources, he writes, "I wanted to write a suspenseful character-driven story of men, heroes, and villains caught up in a tense, desperate time who needed to find courage and cunning to do their duty for their countries and to fulfill their own sense of honor." Howard Blum, where did you grow up?
I grew up in the Bronx, a place called Riverdale. It's the North Bronx, a little community just by the Hudson River.
When did you learn how to write?
I don't know if you ever learn how to write. I'm still learning how to write. Every book, every article is a new experience, and I hope it makes me better and wiser. But I started writing really, the Horace Mann was a school in the Bronx in Riverdale, a private school, and I worked on the newspaper there. And it was pretty exciting as a young kid to see your articles in print, and that made me want to write more. Then I went off to school, the London School of Economics, and I had a girlfriend who was going to the University of Denver at the time. So I wanted to impress her, and I tried to get an article published in the Village Voice in Manhattan. I don't know, I think I was about 18 years old, and they ran the piece, and maybe it impressed her, but that made me convinced that I wanted to be a writer.
Where do you live now?
I move in between a hilltop in Connecticut and East Hampton, New York. I've been spending most of the time in East Hampton lately, and that's where I've been writing and working. I sort of enjoy it. There's a nice community, and in fall, the light in East Hampton is beautiful. It's a piercing bright glow. It's fun to sit in a room surrounded by windows and look out at it and try to find the next word.
Since you left the New York Times, how many books have you written?
16. And I've written 16 books, and I hope to do a few more.
The reason why I wanted to talk to you about Night of the Assassins, which you wrote back in 2020, was because it was a footnote in David Roll's book, Ascent to Power, when I interviewed him, and I said, I got to find out more about that book. And we can talk about it in a moment, but first you have a brand new book out, and what is that?
The book I just published in June was called When the Night Comes Falling, a Requiem for the Idaho Student Murders. And I had started covering the case of 4 students who were killed at the University of Idaho. They were savagely attacked in the middle of the night and brutally murdered by an unknown assailant. After 7 weeks, a suspect was tracked down. He's been arrested. There's a trial still to come. It might not come even for another year. But When the Night Comes Falling, I tell the story not just of the hunt for this suspect, but also of the families involved, the families of the suspect and also the families of the young people who were killed. And I balance their lives, portray them as both as sort of victims. The book starts out with a cross-country trip between the father of the assailant or the alleged assailant, and goes back and forth in time as this trip across America takes place, and a father is coming to terms with the possibility that his son might well be a monster.
All your 16 books, which one did the best?
This book, When the Night Comes Falling, which was published in June, within 5 days hit the New York Times bestseller list. So that seemed to have a lot of tailwind behind it. There were a lot of people interested in the case, and because I had written before for Airmail, the book did quite well. I got on a lot of media shows. But oddly enough, my first book hit the bestseller list nearly 50 years ago, a book called Wanted, The Search for Nazis in America, when I was just a young man just starting out. And that did well too.
Because the Nazis are in The Night of the Assassins. When did you first get interested in the Nazi story?
I had been writing about World War II for a while. I did a book called The Brigade, and this was a story about a group of Jewish soldiers in Palestine during World War II when they finally get permission from Churchill to go fight in Europe. And they go there to Europe, they get involved in a battle, and then the war is immediately over. And then they see what's happened. They go to the concentration camps and they see with their own eyes what has been done to the Jewish people. And they go on a vengeance spree, attacking SS men, tracking them down. But what made that story in the brigade so interesting to me is that they were able to move beyond vengeance to redemption. They start smuggling children from the refugee camps out of Europe and trying to give them new lives in Palestine. And this story of moving from violence and vengeance to redemption seemed something I wanted to tell. And it seems a model that we hope can become real in the world today.
On The Night of the Assassins, when did you first get interested in that story? Because as you tell us in your book, it's been written before.
It has been written before, and I had read a book that I found in Europe when I was studying in Europe about the case, and it seemed totally exaggerated, hyperbolic, made up facts, made up interviews. And I thought, well, this is a really good story, but is it true? And that made me begin to investigate to see if I could find the facts behind that. And then I happened to I came across it because I was looking, memoirs by Churchill's bodyguard, detective, I think it was William Thompson, and Mike Riley, who was FDR's bodyguard during the time, and they allude to this. And that's when I felt there was something there. And then I immediately, as I began looking into it, I went to the Roosevelt Library in Hyde Park, New York, and they had a couple of references to it in the file. Even the dinner, they have the layout of the dinner when the assassination was going to occur. And then there was a New York Times article that was written about a month after the Tehran Conference. And in the New York Times article, FDR has just returned from Europe and North Africa, and he's being interviewed by the press, and he happens to mention, almost throws it off offhandedly, that it seemed that the Nazis were trying to kill us when we were in Tehran. And he says, it would have been a pretty good haul if they got us. And the press just laughs. And then he says, but let me tell you about what's happening with China. And he moves the discussion, and there are no follow-up questions. This was the wartime press. They're a lot different than the press today. And I thought, well, here are all these facts. Can I get to the real story? And that's when I began to dig in.
Mike Riley wrote a book on his own. What year did it come out, and what did you learn from that?
Well, Mike Riley wrote his autobiography, really, and his life as a head of the Secret Service protecting Roosevelt during the war. That came out not long after the war. I think it was 1948 or 1949. And what you learn about that is protecting a president back then was, in spite of all the assassinations in American history, was a pretty laissez-faire job. When this conference is being set in Tehran, the advance squad is just Mike Riley. And he's a guy from Montana. He's never really been out of the country before. And he has to go to Tehran and make sure that this city, which is teeming with German agents, teeming with health problems, is going to be safe for a crippled president traveling all across the world. And that's another point I learned during this writing this story. One has to respect FDR's courage. I mean, he determines to go halfway across the world. He can't even take a single step, and he's going to do this because he's worried about the future of the world after World War II. He wants to meet Stalin face to face, stare him in the eyes, and try to convince Stalin that we can all work together and we can ensure a sort of peace.
You tell a story about Mike Riley and FDR early in the book. I'd never had seen that before, about an assassination attempt.
Yes, Mike Riley becomes head just after the attack on Pearl Harbor. They put Mike Riley ahead of the team that's protecting the president. And one of the reasons why he got that job is that earlier on, while FDR had been campaigning, he would go out in the stump, to go out in a train, and Mike's job was to protect him. And they would try to do it on railroad cars, a presidential railroad car, because that way FDR couldn't walk. They could escort him out. He could stand next to Secret Service agents, and he'd be holding on to the rail of the train. And in the crowd one day, someone throws a knife at the president. And Riley writes about this because he thought, this is it. I've blown my job. The president is going to be hit. He can't move. He's an immovable target. And yet it turned out to be a rubber knife. It was just meant as a warning to FDR, but it stayed in Riley's mind as a warning of what could happen. It was an image that really kept him up at night.
Do you know if they ever arrested the guy that threw the rubber knife?
Oh, I assume they did arrest him, but Riley doesn't write about that. It was oddly enough, in Pennsylvania. It was a key state in the election, just as it is today in the election that's coming up. And it was also the site of another assassination attempt in Pennsylvania earlier this summer on Trump.
So another story early in the book, before you get into the Night of the Assassins, is the story about the Duke of Windsor. Explain that one.
The Duke of Windsor was flirting with the Nazis. He had met with Hitler. He and the Duchess had met with Hitler. He seemed to admire Hitler. Hitler gets it into his head that he wants the Duke to come and support Germany and to live in Germany during the war. And he's going to offer him £200,000, which is a fortune, several $1 million today. He then gives the head of the SS Security Division, General Walter Schellenberg, this mission to kidnap the Duke of Windsor while he's hunting in Portugal with his wife. They're staying at a finca, an estate there. And Schellenberg puts it all together, and he realizes this is going to be impossible. So what he does is, rather than tell Hitler he can't pull it off, he leaks the information that a kidnapping attempt is going to take place. That convinces the British to surround the Duke with security and eventually send him off to the Bahamas and get him out of Portugal, get him away from the scene of the potential crime.
What did Hitler think he was going to get by kidnapping him and putting him in Switzerland? What was the advantage?
Well, what he thought he would have, one would be embarrass the British government, but also he would have a government in waiting. After he was going to take over the British Isles, he'd then be able to put his king in, which would have been the Duke. The Duke liked the idea, I think, of returning as king, and certainly the Duchess of Windsor wanted to be queen, and they had this vision that they would return and Herr Hitler would make it all possible.
So when you set out to write this book, how did you start?
I started, first thing I did was really try to get a hold of the Russian work that had been done on this. The Russians in 2003 had released a book called Tehran 43, and they did it with great fanfare. They had a press conference. They had a Russian security officer speak and talked about the secret files. They had even one of the people who had been involved in the actual events as a young man, now was much older, of course, and he was there too. And I had that book translated. Once I had that book translated, I had a foundation to move forward from. And then I went into the memoirs by Mike Riley, by Churchill's personal bodyguard, and I tried to put the various pieces together. This was an incident that was referred to in many histories. It also had its fair share of detractors, some scholarly detractors who said it was just Russian propaganda. I had to consider that, if that was accurate, and I made my judgment that it wasn't, and I then put the pieces together in a narrative that put all the events that could be substantiated into a consistent whole. And to tell the story, I sort of made it into a cat and mouse game between three people. On one hand, I had Mike Riley, who described himself as an Irish cop with more brawn than brains, head of FDR's Secret Service, a guy from Montana, a former college football player who grew up in a mining town in Montana, coming to DC, given this great responsibility at just 33 years old to protect a wartime president. And this just wasn't any wartime president. This was a wartime president who couldn't take a single step. He would be literally a sitting target. And opposite him, you had Walter Schellenberg, who was the same age as Mike Riley, 33, the youngest general in Germany. He was the SS Foreign Intelligence head of SD, as it was known, and yet he wasn't your dyed-in-the-wool SS man. He was just sort of a pragmatist. He wasn't a true believer. He wanted to get ahead. And the third part of this triangle was Otto Skorzeny. Otto Skorzeny was called by the New York Herald Tribune as the most dangerous man in Europe. He was the commando who would stage the rescue of Mussolini from a hilltop where the Italians were keeping him. And he leads a glider raid where 12 gliders swoop down from the sky on this Italian mountain, find Mussolini, drag him out of there, get rid of the Italian forces that are defending him in what was supposedly an impregnable fortress, and takes him back to meet with Hitler to great acclaim. And Skorzeny was the hero who was going to lead and plan this mission to kill the big three.
What do people like Schellenberg and Skorzeny look like to the Germans today? Do they honor them at all?
Skorzeny still has a following. Skorzeny has had this remarkable career. He was, after the war, he's tried by the Allies for war crimes. The crime was that he had put on Allied uniforms and his men during the Battle of the Bulge, and this was considered a war crime. It was proven during the course of the trial that the U.S. did the same thing, put on German uniforms. So he was freed. He then goes to Spain and then Ireland. He's involved in smuggling Nazis out of Europe to South America. And then he's hired by the Israeli Mossad to work on finding ex-Nazi war criminals. So this has been documented in the Israeli press. So he's someone who's still revered in Germany. Schellenberg, we've just seen it, I think, as a tactician. He was convicted of war crimes, spent 8 years in jail, and then died of a heart attack afterwards. And Mike Riley, interestingly enough, is just sort of forgotten. He goes off after the war, after FDR dies, and goes work for Boeing. He goes out to California, and he marries a great many times, and his life just sort of falls apart.
You do say, and this is not important to the story, that Mike Riley was by his side in Warm Springs when he died and was responsible for making sure that the food that he'd eaten for breakfast was sent off to be diagnosed.
Yes, and Mike's last act, really, while he still headed the detail, was to analyze the food that FDR had. I mean, he was sick. They knew he wasn't well. They expected him to die, but Mike Riley just wanted to be sure. He had that sort of devotion to the man he called the boss. And he literally was willing to put his life in front of any bullet that was aimed at FDR.
Were you able to talk to anybody who was still alive from that incident in World War II?
No, there was just I could not find anyone who was still around. It's a story that belongs to history.
We haven't gotten to the specifics on the night of the assassins, but you also point out in the back in their sources that there are people that don't believe any of this.
Yes, there are, and there's one. There's an Australian professor who's written about what Germany did during the war in Iran. He's an authority, and he believes it's all a Russian propaganda plot. Though he's admitted, he said, why would Russia want to make propaganda out of this? And I said the only reason they want to make propaganda out of it because it's true. But I disagree with him, and so have other historians. But he is a legitimate source. What he has documented to a large degree is Germany's efforts during the war to take control of Iran. Germany, when the war broke out, had a large presence in Iran. Iran basically means Aryan. The Germans supported Hitler Shah. And then the British in 1941 and the Russians invade Iran, take control of it. And Germany then decides to send commando missions into Iran. This is also well documented. They send paratroopers in to disrupt supply lines into Iran. Remember that the U.S. was sending Lend-Lease material through Iran to Russia. The ships would come in to Iran, then go across the country on the railroad.
So this meeting was trying to be put together as a secret meeting. Who was in charge of trying to bring the three together, and who was the most difficult to get to the table?
Well, the idea was that we should meet together was both FDR's and Churchill. Churchill was the first one to articulate it, I think, publicly in the summer of 43 at a conference in Canada. FDR wanted it desperately because he thought if he could look into Stalin's eyes, he can convince him that the US and Russia could work together after the war. Stalin was being very difficult. He had all excuses why he didn't want to come to the meeting. FDR and Churchill were proposing we would have the meeting first in Alaska, then we would have it in North Africa, then we would have it in a boat out at sea where it could be protected. Churchill, perhaps even whimsically, said we could all meet in tents in the desert, and he gave a biblical reference that he sent off to Stalin. But Stalin was not having any of it. He said he was a wartime commander. He said he had to be near the front. Also, part of it was, other historians have said, that he was afraid of flying. He didn't want to go too far. And Tehran was about as far as he would go. And if you're going to pick a place to have this meeting, this is arguably Tehran, the worst possible place. I mean, the British and Russians had ostensible control of the country, but it was teeming with foreign agents, German agents. The Germans had sent paratroopers in there, and yet this is where Stalin wanted the meeting.
What were the three legations like? The British, the American, and the Russians. Where were they located in Tehran?
Well, the American legation, and we didn't have an embassy at that point. We didn't have an ambassador. We had a plenipotentiary. Was about 10 miles out of town. It had a wall around it, but to get to it for embassies, and I think Russia and British had embassies. You have to go about 10 miles, and going 10 miles across Tehran, every Secret Service agent's great fear is driving through a city with rooftops. You think of the Kennedy assassination, and this was in wartime, so they would have to go back and forth each day. The British and Russian embassies were these grand buildings surrounded by a park with fountains, and they were also surrounded by a wall, while the U.S. was at the other side. And Mike Riley, even Churchill, actually, Churchill writes in his memoirs when he's going through Tehran, when he first arrives, he arrives into the city, and it's supposed to be secret. And there's the British ambassador to welcome him, there's a band, and then on the whole ride into the city is lined with Iranian cavalry officers. And they're wearing these red uniforms, and Churchill writes about being scared stiff at any moment when they're caught in traffic and the car is just idling. Someone could come out of the crowd and shoot me. He says if the situation was ever designed to put me in the greatest danger, this was it. If they wanted me to get assassinated, well, they had set things up pretty well. He says words to that effect in his memoir.
Exactly what was the date that they had the meeting?
The meeting occurred the last week in November. I think it started November 27th, 1943.
The decision made to have the meeting there.
Yes, the decision was made probably about 4 weeks earlier. What had happened was Secretary of State, they thought the meeting wasn't going to take place. Churchill and FDR decided to meet. They will meet with Shanghai Shek in Egypt. That's what's going to happen in North Africa. While this is happening, Cordell Hull, the U.S. Secretary of State, goes to meet with his Russian counterpart. And they agree finally that this meeting will take place in the last week of November. Mike Riley has been sent to Morocco to do the advance work on the FDR's visit to Cairo and North Africa. While he's in Morocco, he meets with Hull. Hull tells him the meeting's going to take place. Mike Riley now has to hightail it to Tehran and check it out. And this is Mike Riley, who's a stranger to the entire country. He's an advance team of one to check things out.
All right, this is a little bit off subject, but who is Lili Sanjari?
Lili Sanjari is a fascinating figure. She comes from an Iranian family that has ties to Germany. She studies in Germany. She comes back just before the war when she's about 19, very attractive woman. She immediately begins having an affair with a German agent who's already been embedded in Tehran. And he is, as it turns out, is going to be one of the liaisons that the Germans are going to use to set up the assassination of the Big Three. While she's having this affair with this liaison agent, she's also having an affair with an American CIC, military intelligence officer, who's using the cover of playing as a military officer in a jazz band. You can't make this stuff up, to the troops in Tehran. And that's another element of the whole jazz band. A large part of the American contingent in Tehran are African Americans. We would not send them, the government would not send them to combat situations. They deliberately sent them to this backwater part of the war to work as mechanics on American trucks and to assist American engineers and their Tehran. And this agent that she's having the affair with, his name is Robert Merrill, and it's impossible to track him down. He's referred to in the interrogations that the British have and the Americans have I couldn't find any military record of him, and perhaps it's just a pseudonym that was used. And history has lost who this man was and what his real name actually was.
At the end of 1943, what was the status of the war?
By 1943, the Germans are realizing that the war is lost. Uh, after this is after the defeat at Stalingrad, the invasion of North Africa, the invasion of Sicily. What they're hoping for at this point is that they will keep on fighting, and America will get tired of losses and will just make peace. And with this peace, Germany will be able to, perhaps the Reich will survive. They'll be able to keep their plunder, and there'll be no real large recriminations against the German people and the German regime. However, then in January 1943, what FDR is meeting with Churchill in North Africa. FDR surprises even Churchill by announcing to the world that what this war will only end in an unconditional surrender. This fact that there will be an unconditional surrender, and really the last time this has happened in history where demanded an unconditional surrender, was when Carthage must be destroyed, and it was. And the German high regime realizes there will be no negotiated peace. They realize that this war will end with a complete Allied victory, and they will then have to pay for their crimes against humanity, their crimes against the Jewish people, and for their waging war. And this will end only one way, with their going on trial and perhaps most likely hanging from the gallows when the verdicts are handed out. So now the German high command tries to look for another way. And their plan to assassinate the big three is not to win the war. It's not to change the Allies' capacity to fight, just as we see the Israeli assassinations that are taking place today. Those are to defeat the enemy, to stop Hezbollah from fighting. They just want to replace Churchill, FDR, and Stalin. They believe they get rid of them. Perhaps there'll be new leaders that will allow a negotiated settlement. There won't be this unconditional surrender demand. That unconditional surrender demand is what sets this whole plot in motion.
How much did Joseph Stalin and Winston Churchill and FDR know about the plot of the Nazis to kill them?
Well, they knew a surprising amount, and that's another testimony to their courage. During the course of the meeting, the conference in Tehran, FDR moves from the US Embassy, which is 10 miles out of town, to stay at the Russian Embassy. He goes to the Russian Embassy and he has to assume that it's bugged. Mike Riley talks about the Russian waiters, and you could see under their coats that their guns were there. They knew what they were getting into, yet they thought this would be even safer, provide more security than staying at the American Embassy. Mike Riley, as soon as he lands, gets his first day in Tehran with FDR, is told by a Russian general that 43, I think it is, German parachutists had come into the country. They were caught by the Russians, and then they have to change that. The 6 escaped. So there are 6 trained killers still on the loose, and both FDR, Churchill, and Stalin are all aware of this during the course of the conference.
Did the Nazis and who in the Nazi regime knew about the meeting? Because as you tell us in the book, it was on and off and all that. And who was the one that said, let's go, and named this whole event?
Well, Schellenberg and the SD, as well as the Abwehr, which is the German non-SS Secret Service headed by Admiral Konarsis, they had an agent working in Ankara, Turkey. This man was the valet to the British ambassador, and he was a strange little man. And the ambassador would treat him as almost a plaything. He would dress him up in Arabian Nights outfits. But when the ambassador went to sleep and took his sleeping pills, this spy, known as Cicero, because the documents he stole talk so eloquently, Cicero would open the safe with the key that was left on the ambassador's nightstand and get the telegrams, the diplomatic uh, information that was coming in. This was passed on to the Germans. They then found out about the meeting, and this was when the signal was to go ahead. And what was so fortuitous for the Germans when they found out about this meeting, here was a operation where they already had agents embedded in Tehran because they sent them there earlier in the war. They'd already run parachute missions into Iran because they were trying to disrupt the Lend-Lease railroad cars that were bringing supplies to the Russians. And Scorzini was in charge of these earlier missions, and he was the man they wanted to run the assassination attempt. So everything seemed to fall together for them, and they thought that this operation really could succeed.
So go back to the fact that they dropped 43 paratroopers into Iran. Were they dressed with Russian uniforms on?
They did what they wanted to do. They had a large contingent of the assassins. They recruited from renegade Russian soldiers. Vlaslav, he was a general, and he was now working on the for the Russians. He had turned for the Germans rather. He had turned sides in the course of the war. They recruited men from there. They trained them. They wore Russian uniforms. The German contingent was going to be led by Scorzini, but he eventually, for reasons, doesn't go into the operation. It's headed by a guy named Flug, and they wore German uniforms.
Who were the wrestlers?
When these 6 men are on the loose in Tehran, and they're literally running for their lives, they get into the city. They know their compatriots have been captured. They know that the embedded agents that they're also supposed to work with have been captured, been betrayed by Lili Sanjari to some degree that we mentioned before. They need a place to stay. They need somewhere where they'll be safe because they're waiting for a specific date, the night of the assassins. They get to Tehran and they're letting the conference take place to the moment when they have already pre-planned when they're going to strike. So they need a place to lay low. They are taken to what is a Iranian wrestling facility. But in Iran, wrestling is not what we think of, American wrestling. It's almost a spiritual practice, and it's a combination religious temple and also a wrestling mat. It's also shaped almost like a triangle. The buildings, it has a low entranceway, so you have to bow your head when you enter as a supplication to the spirits. And this is where they lay low, waiting for the night of the assassins.
So the end of all this, there's the tunnel. There's the night of the birthday party for Winston Churchill. Put all that together.
The big question is when the Germans are making this plan to attack the big three at the Tehran Conference. They know they're going to be there for nearly a week. When should they attack? When is the perfect time? The Germans decide we need to get a time when they'll all be together, and we need a time when they're hopefully at ease and their bodyguards will be at ease too. So they figure the actual conferences, when they're meeting behind closed doors, those will be under tight security. Schellenberg, the German head, starts doing research, and he realizes that November 30th is Winston Churchill's 69th birthday. And he decides this is a time, that evening, there will be a birthday party for for Churchill, all the leaders will be together, and it so happens that actually does work out that way. There's even a photo I found in the FDR archives where the big three are sitting shoulder to shoulder at this birthday party. The cake is in front of them with the candles. But how are they going to get into the British compound where this is taking place? One of the agents, the German agents who's there, is looking for a way. Can you go over rooftops? Can you be at a distance and maybe put a sniper? He notices that one of the first things any visitor to Tehran notices is the water. It's undrinkable. There's illness throughout the whole country. The same drinking water is also used for latrines that run through canals that run through the city. What the embassies have done is the U.S. engineers have dug water tunnels that come down from the mountains and bring in fresh waters into the embassy. And he sees this, and his plan is to sneak the assassins into the entrance of the water tunnel that will go underground, emerge out into the park surrounding the British embassy dining room. And then it's inside as the voices are raised and happy birthday, dear Winston, happy birthday, dear Winston. The assassins will burst through the dining room doors and deliver Hitler's birthday present to the big three. That was the original plan.
What happened?
What happened was they're basically, as soon as they get to Tehran, everything starts falling apart. The Russians capture the main part of the force. 6 men survive and are running for their lives. They take refuge, waiting for this night of the assassins to make it to the water tunnels. But the water tunnels are now protected by the Allies. They have found out about this plot because they've arrested one of the German conspirators. So they still have to come up with a plan. But now these 6 surviving German assassins are betrayed by the wrestlers that they're hanging out with. They manage to escape, and that the plan is that they will then get the Allies as they're making the big three as they're making their ways to the plains to leave Tehran. However, the location is given away. There's a $200,000 reward, I think. Actually, it's $20,000 reward, and so their location is betrayed, and the Russian troops, along with Mike Riley, come in, and just as they're about to come in and arrest them, the Germans blow themselves up. They brought gammon bombs, which are the type of explosive that they hope to use on the big three. They use it to end their own lives. And that's what happens on the night of the assassins.
What happened to the parachuters that came in and got caught?
That's the question when Mike Riley asks his Russian counterpart, what happens to the men you caught? And he says, they're not talking anymore. And that's all he's told. And one assumes that they were killed. As Mike Riley says, I would not have wanted to have been one of those German parachuters.
By the way, thank you for telling the story. I know this is, you have a book like this, you don't want to give it away, but it's been a couple years. There's
Well,
still.
we all know FDR survives, and so does Churchill and Stalin. They go off to meet in Yalta. But I'm not revealing who wins the war. That you have to read the book to find out.
There is a lot that, of course, intricate stories in here about different people. There's a moment where Mike Riley is excited that he's going to get FDR out of there. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, they decide to stay 2 more days. Why?
They decide to stay 2 more days because FDR is convinced that he's making headway with Stalin. He believes, and this again is a tribute to FDR, he knows he's a dying man. He's looking for his legacy. He's a true patriot. He's putting the country first before his own health, and he believes that there's a chance to making a better world when this war is over. They've also gone there to discuss D-Day. FDR and Churchill wanted, FDR and Stalin wanted to go through France and go the quickest route possible. Churchill wants to go through Italy and up into Germany. And his concern is really protecting the Mediterranean for the rest of the British Empire. and they're fighting against too. They want to make sure that everyone's on the same side for D-Day.
It was secret. How did FDR get to Cairo in the first place?
FDR never announces this to the American people. There's a cover story that he's going out on the presidential yacht for a cruise for about a week to escape the tensions of the war. While he's on the presidential yacht, I think it's called the Sequoia, a boat comes alongside. He's literally taken off. He has to be carried down and taken out to sea where there is a U.S. battleship, the Iowa, which is the largest ship in the world at that time. And this flotilla is going to take him secretly, along with members of the Joint Chiefs, members of his staff, and they're going to take him to North Africa and then to Iran. While they're at sea during the first couple of days, it's boring time. They want to impress the commander in chief. They start doing exercises. They send balloons up to the air in the air for target practice. And the big guns on the Iowa start blasting away and kill the balloons. One of the destroyers is also doing exercises, and they don't know the president is on the Iowa, and they start targeting. What you do in a exercise is you try to use a ship as your target. They use the Iowa, and they sent off 7 dummy missiles. The 6 of them are dummies, however, and the 7th one is by mistake a real missile. And here's FDR, a real torpedo is coming across the water, and they see it coming, and they think they're sitting ducks. If the commander of the battleship doesn't steer it away at the last minute, FDR would have been blown up by friendly fire. This American commander who did this had his career ruined.
What kind of an airplane did FDR fly in, and how long did it take him to get from point A to point B?
FDR had a special plane made for him. He sends Mike Riley out to California to work with the Boeing Corporation to design this plane. It's called the Sacred Cow, and it has a windows at a certain level, portholes really, so that FDR, who couldn't stand, could look outside. He also made sure it had a refrigerator so he could keep his martinis really chilled. And it was a big ship, and it from him, when it met him in Cairo, it took him just about a day to fly to Tehran. The big question was if they had to go over 6,000 feet to get over the mountains, or could they fly below 6,000 feet? Over 6,000 feet, the doctor who was traveling with FDR thought the president's heart couldn't survive such a high climb. But they were able to prove, Mike Riley went on a test run, they were able to make the trip under 6,000 feet. So they didn't have to take the railroad car that had been provided for them, because Mike Riley felt that car, even though it was the Shah's car and was filled with gold fixtures, he thought it was a breeding place for dysentery.
Are you aware of any American effort to kill Hitler or to kill Mussolini? We know about the Germans that tried to kill Hitler, but how about an American effort, just like Hitler's effort to kill these 3 leaders?
There have been stories about that Americans sent a marksman out to get him, but none of them has been substantiated. The British have had this too, and it's sort of interesting that the Americans did not really make it a full-fledged policy to engage in political assassinations. That wasn't the American way. We have a history of American presidents being assassinated. We weren't prepared to do that to the enemy.
Whatever happened to Lili Sanjari?
Lili Sanjari is arrested by the British. She's interrogated. And one of the interesting things I did, the Kew archives outside London, there's a 32-page transcript of her interrogation by Captain Joe Spencer of the British, and you can read that. And she's allowed to stay in Tehran, and then she just disappears. There's no record of what became of her.
Anybody else among the leadership killed because of their activities in this?
No, you know, Schellenberg survives it and is arrested after the war. Skorzeny dies an old man, and Mike Riley retires from the government, goes to work for Boeing, and he dies in his early 50s.
Any characters we've not talked about that you were interested in when you wrote this book?
Well, one of the characters, oddly enough, is Leslie Howard, the actor from Gone with the Wind. The Germans early on are convinced when Churchill is visiting North Africa that he's going to fly back on a commercial plane from Portugal. And they have a spy set up at the airport, the Portola airport in Portugal, to see if Churchill gets on this one plane that goes off each day that has 7 seats and makes the trip from Lisbon to the United Kingdom. And at the airport there, it's really a scene out of Casablanca. People are trying to buy tickets on this plane or whatever. There's only 7 seats on the plane. The German spy who's sitting at the airport has a perfect view at the gangplank going towards the plane. And he sees a man that looks like Churchill, Hamburg, the 8-inch cigar coming from the mouth, and a tall, thin man following him that looks like Walter Thompson, Churchill's bodyguard. And he reports to the German APFAR, the intelligence headquarters in Lisbon. This is it. They send the word to send fighters out to get the plane. The fighters shoot the plane out of the sky, but it happens that Churchill is not on board. Churchill writes about this. He was saved by he says, by the workings of fate. But who the Germans thought were Churchill and his bodyguard were really Leslie Howard, the actor, and his accountant who were traveling. His accountant was husky like Churchill and wore a Hamburg and smoked a cigar. And Leslie Howard was tall and thin like Churchill's bodyguard. And they became really footnotes to this larger assassination story.
Did you get the kind of response to this book that you hoped for?
No. This book, I think, was published during the height of COVID, and it just didn't take off. And it was very disappointing. I then sold it to Sony Pictures and for a series, and the producers were the team that was involved in Homeland, Alex Donza and Howard Gordon, really smart guys. And that too just never succeeded. We haven't given up, but of all my books, oddly enough, this might have been the book that just didn't catch on. It was the timing. And, you know, books need a certain sort of luck, just like Assassins, if you're really going to strike successfully. And this one didn't.
Any of your books made into movies?
I had one that was made into a TV series about the John Walker spy case. It was 8 nights on CBS. I have a couple that are going now, oddly enough. The book I did 11 years ago called The Floor of Heaven about the Yukon Gold Rush. A true story about a cowboy detective who gets involved with a gangster and the man who originally found the gold. And as it happened, Ron Howard was on a shoot in Australia. He had 2 weeks off. Somehow this book was around on a bookshelf. He picked it up, and I get a call the next day, and now Ron is making that. And it's been a pleasure to work with him. Then I have a book which you mentioned before, The Brigade. That's being made by Lionsgate. And When the Night Comes Falling, about the Idaho student murders, is being made into a series by the Village Roadshow. So I have a couple of things going now. Again, Hollywood is a long, perilous route. There's no sure things, but I'm optimistic, as I guess every writer needs to be if he's going to keep on writing.
Tell us of your writing techniques. For instance, do you research everything first and begin writing?
I usually like to research for at least a year first, but at the same time, I'm always writing out opening paragraphs. I'm always outlining how to tell the story. Uh, the key thing I believe in writing is sort of structure. How do you find the point of view into the drama you're telling? For the Idaho book, for example, here you had a murder case. How can I tell it from whose point of view? And I found this car trip that the father and son take across America. And in the course of this journey, the father starts to have suspicions about his son. And this was the foundation of my being able to go back and forth in time and tell the various different stories that come together when the night comes falling about the Idaho student murders. So that structure is the key for me.
Tell us how you write, time of day, computer, longhand, all that.
I'm pretty regimented. What I like to do is, make coffee by 7, uh, look at the New York Times headlines, check the Yankee scores, and then by 7:30, I'm sitting here writing on a laptop. Uh, you know, I'm old enough that I think, my first book in longhand and had my old college typewriter. Then I moved to a clunky console IBM sort of word processor. And probably the last 10, 12 books have been on this trusty laptop I'm on right now.
When do you send what you have to the editor?
I'm every day before I start the next day's writing, I rewrite. I rewrite and rewrite constantly. And that's one of the great things about computers. You're able to rewrite quickly, but you lose your earlier drafts. I usually wait till I have a finished first draft, and then I send that off to the editor. They so far after 16 books, they never really take too much editing. Uh, and one of the great things over the editing process, when you're working with a good editor, it's really exciting because they see things you've missed and they can make it better. And I really enjoy that. It's like fine tuning. It's like picking the tie to match your jacket or whatever. It's you put the outfits together perfectly, and I like that. That's my favorite part of it. When it's going to be done, it's in the final stages, and all you're doing now is making it as close to perfect as you can.
When I look at the list of books you've done, 2024, 22, 20, 18, 16, 11, 2008, there are others, of course, in there. Have you already started on your next book?
I have an idea. And I've just been discussing it with my publishers. Whether or not they're as enthusiastic about it as I am remains to be seen. But what all the books have in common is I tell stories. It doesn't matter if I'm writing about assassins in World War II or a murder case in Idaho that's contemporary. They're all stories and stories about people. And I think I found a large topic where I can tell a good and exciting story. And usually my books are pretty eclectic, the topics, because one of the great things about being a writer is it's like going to school again. You can keep on learning things. And the idea that someone is paying me to learn something new, well, I find that one of the blessings of a writer's life.
How much influence did you have on your daughter that led her to work for the New York Times?
She would say absolutely none. she's it just so happened that way. I don't seem to have influence on any of my 3 kids. They've all gone off to accomplish good things, and I'm very proud of them. But I don't think they would claim I had no influence. Their mom, who I'm divorced from, is very smart. She probably influenced them more.
Howard Blum's latest book is called When the Night Comes Falling, about the Idaho murders. And the one that we were talking to him about is Night of the Assassins, the untold story of Hitler's plot to kill FDR, Churchill, and Stalin. One last question. How often? I mean, I learned about your book from a footnote in David Roll's book called Ascent to Power. How often does that kind of thing happen where you pick up some interest in a book when somebody else mentions it?
I'm always finding something interesting that I hear from other people. I read a column, I think 2 weeks ago, by Brett Stevens, who writes for the Times, and I usually disagree with him, except when he writes about Israel, which I agree with. And that's why I've been reading him more recently. But he mentioned a book that I'd never heard of. It was Memoir of Hadrian. And he said, everyone has to read this book. And it's a novel, as if it was written as if it's Hadrian's memoir. But it's very wise. It was written in 1949 by a French woman. And I'm so glad I read it. Yeah, it's been exciting.
Howard Blum, thank you for your time. Appreciate
Appreciate
it.
talking with you. I appreciate the thoughtful conversation. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Booknotes Plus podcast. Please rate and review Booknotes Plus, and don't forget to follow so you never miss an episode. Questions or comments, we would love to hear from you. You can email us at podcasts@c-span.org.